Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We're really excited to get into kind of our kickoff for Student Parent Month here at Trellis Strategies. We're going to be going over one of our latest reports on degrees of responsibility and really kind of diving into the data on how institutions, policymakers, governments, really the full gamut here can better support students who are caregiving while they're enrolled in college. We're going to wait a minute or two to get started here as folks kind of trickle in, but we're so excited to get started, and we'll just hold tight for a minute or so to let more folks join us. And then I will kick it off to Dr. May Plumb and Carrie Welton to introduce themselves.
Go ahead, Carrie. Why don't you start?
Thanks, May. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Carrie Welton. I'm the Senior Policy Strategist here at Trellis.
And I'm May Plumb. I'm a research associate focusing on qualitative research, and I'll be going through the data today. So with that, why don't we jump right in to talk about the caregiving students who responded to the Student Financial Wellness Survey in 2024, who are going to be our kind of focus group for this session. For anyone who's not familiar, the Student Financial Wellness Survey is an annual online survey that documents the financial well-being and student success indicators for post-secondary students across the United States. It's directed voluntarily by institutions who then use the results to raise money, develop programs, assess initiatives, and in general build a culture of caring for our students. We'll have a link at the end of the presentation if anyone's interested in fielding it at their institution this coming fall. The data in this presentation comes from the fall 2024 implementation of the Student Financial Wellness Survey, which was sent out to over 600,000 students and received responses from over 53,000 students for a response rate of around 8%. It was fielded at 104 institutions total, roughly evenly split between 2-year and 4-year schools. And in particular, today we're going to be talking about the 1 in 5 respondents to the Student Financial Wellness Survey who self-identified as a caregiver. So in total, 19% of respondents either indicated they were a parent or indicated that they provided caregiving support for some other individual. And this includes 7% of respondents who said they were provided care for both a child and another individual. And I'll note here that 2-year students were more likely to self-identify as caregivers at 25% compared to 4-year students at just 13%. And so I wanted to disaggregate this information by school sector, so you could see that, but also give a little brief comparison to the National Postsecondary Student Age Study, which is a nationally representative study. In general, the Student Financial Wellness Survey asks students to self-identify, right? And we ask both about kind of legal guardianship, but also caregiving responsibility, where in NIPSAS, they're going off of legal dependency specifically. So the numbers come out slightly differently, particularly for non-child dependents. You can see here that the numbers are overall fairly similar for kind of identifying those students we might identify as parents, but where 11% of 2-year students said that they were a caregiver or legal guardian to some other dependent. In NIPSAS, we only see 4% of 2-year students who have non-child legal dependents. However, I'll note right down at the bottom of the slide here that the percentage of total caregivers is pretty similar between the Student Financial Wellness Survey and NIPSAS. And what we're really seeing here is that the Student Financial Wellness Survey captures a kind of larger group of students who identify as having a child and providing care to some other dependent, quite possibly not with like a legal dependency, but who could see that as that caregiving is a big part of their lives. So it's capturing a little bit of a student group that's missed if you only look at kind of tax record purposes. To give a little bit of a demographic picture of these students, caregiving students in the Student Financial Wellness Survey are disproportionately Black and female. In each of these charts, we see non-caregivers, caregivers, and what I'm dubbing double caregivers. That's that group of students who indicate they both provide care to a child and some other dependent. And so for example, 34% of double caregivers are Black or African American compared to just 12% of the non-caregiving population. And similarly, we have about 3/4 of caregivers are female compared to just over half of non-caregivers. And I'll note here as well that the data that I'll be showing here today is weighted to account for age, gender, and enrollment intensity. It's not weighted to account for race, but the overall kind of sample versus population metrics for race line up quite well. And it is weighted on the institutional sample rather than to like the national picture of all students. And additionally here, I want to note that while most non-caregiving students are younger, caregiving students are represented across all age brackets. This is not just older students. It's also about 20% of the caregivers in our sample are under the age of 25. And so to give to kind of set the stage for the data I'm going to share with you today, I want to draw your attention to three kind of focal points for caregiving students. One is that they have increased financial responsibilities often, right? And this can impact their student success by meaning they work longer hours, and also by increasing their levels of financial insecurity and increasing their levels of debt. With those longer work hours comes time poverty, which is also kind of further amplified by caregiving obligations, which also take up time and energy in a student's life. And kind of as a third, but also very interrelated sector here is their identity as a caregiver, which can interfere with their identity as a student, making it hard to prioritize the work that they need to do as a student because they have these other very important responsibilities in their life that are taking both time and mental energy. So using this as a backdrop, let's jump into this data. And I want to start with this fact that caregivers are balancing a lot of non-tuition financial responsibilities. In particular, 85% of caregiving students in the Student Financial Wellness Survey agreed that it was important for them to support their family financially. And this is in comparison to just 34% of non-caregivers, right? And as kind of particular case studies, 34% of these caregivers said that they provided financial support to their spouse, and about a quarter provided financial support to a parent or guardian, right? So their money is getting pulled in a lot of different directions. And I want to give some actual numbers to this by drawing on childcare as an example. This is information from a recent report by the Education Trust, which estimated that the average student, if they're working a minimum wage job, would need to work about 54 hours a week to pay for both center-based childcare and net tuition at a public four-year college in their state. I've pulled out 4 states as examples here, but overall, this report found that there was no state where a student could work, just 10, 15 hours a week and cover these financial obligations. And so quite possibly as a result of these various financial pressures, caregivers face higher rates of financial insecurity. In the Student Financial Wellness Survey, we saw that 70% of caregiving students said they would have trouble covering a $500 emergency. This is in comparison to about half of non-caregivers. And this indicates their lack of financial resiliency in the face of everything that life throws our way. In particular, 4 out of 5 caregivers said that they had run out of money at least once during the past year. So that's from January 1 of 2024 up until the point in the fall when they took the survey. And I'll particularly draw your attention here to the right-hand side of the graph where 38% of caregivers said they had run out of money 8 or more times. And that's a 20 percentage point bump in comparison to their non-caregiving peers. We also see financial insecurity represented as basic needs and security. In particular, I want to draw your attention to the housing metric here. 62% of caregivers reported experiencing housing insecurity in the past year. And that's in comparison to 38% of their non-caregiving peers. But we also see similar increases in food insecurity and homelessness, and also in the rate of experiencing multiple forms of basic needs insecurity. And to further extend this picture of caregivers' finances, we can see that caregivers have high rates of both student and personal debt. So 43% of caregiving students said that their total debt was unmanageable at the time of the survey. And in particular, only 5% indicated that they had no debt. That was very, very common. The piece of the debt puzzle that's most interesting to me personally is that 42% of caregivers had used buy now, pay later services in the past year. This is about double the rate in their non-caregiving peers. And while we don't have yet a really robust understanding of how these buy now, pay later services play into the larger picture of credit and debt, it seems likely that this is an indicator of the kind of extreme lack of financial flexibility and the lack of cash availability for these students. And turning to the student debt side, about half of caregiving respondents reported that they had taken out student loans to pay for college. And 61% of these students with loans said that they had more student debt than they expected to have. And this matches information we've seen in prior studies. So to give a number to this, one analysis of the 2020 NIPSAS found that parenting students specifically had taken out an average of over $8,000 more in student loans compared to their non-parenting peers. And so this becomes an area where debt can really increase for caregivers. Quite likely as a result of these various stressors, or as a clear kind of related variable, these caregiving students work more than their non-caregiving peers. 71% of caregivers worked while enrolled, and this chart shows the breakdown for those working students of about how many hours they reported working per week. And so we can see on the right-hand side of the graph that 68% of employed caregivers reported working 40 or more hours per week during the school year. So while they were taking classes, compared to just 36% of their non-caregiving peers. And we can see that as these other responsibilities increase, for example, for work, student identity can end up taking a backseat. The one way that we measure this in the Student Financial Wellness Survey is by asking students, do you identify primarily as a worker that goes to school or as a student who works? And among caregiving students, 3/4 identified primarily as a worker that goes to school, compared to just 28% of their non-caregiving peers. And we also see this reflected in their enrollment intensity. 65% of caregivers were enrolled part-time, compared to 35% of non-caregiving respondents. And we know that as student identity becomes lower in priority, as they decrease their enrollment intensity and kind of their momentum towards graduation slows, it can be more and more difficult for learners to persist. And on top of the work commitments that we've already talked about, caregiving is its own time commitment. 55% of caregivers reported spending 40 or more hours per week on dependent care each week, with an additional 18% reporting spending between 20 and 40 hours each week. And these two factors of dependent care and time at employment combine to create some really extreme levels of time poverty for caregiving students. So in total, 82% of caregivers reported that their combined dependent care and work obligations added up to at least 40 hours per week. including 27% of all of these caregiving respondents indicated that they spent 80 or more hours per week on dependent care and work obligations, which is a really acute level of time poverty that is going to interfere with their ability to engage with their studies. And so this just comes back to the fact that one of the really crucial aspects of student success, especially for caregiving students, is accessible dependent care. The Student Financial Wellness Survey focuses on parents for this portion and asks parents about their experiences with childcare. And around a quarter indicated that they had missed at least one class due to lack of childcare in the prior semester. So again, they're taking this survey in the fall. This question asks about the spring 2024 semester. And I want to call out here that this analysis includes the students who said not applicable, perhaps because they weren't enrolled in the spring or because they didn't require childcare in the spring. And so the number is maybe slightly inflated by that analysis. And as the last piece of data here, I want to draw out this question where we asked parents about a hypothetical loss of childcare and how that would impact their academic journey. So around a third of parents said that if they lost their access to their childcare, they would need to take fewer classes or drop classes, right? And that really speaks to their ability to maintain academic momentum through the various ups and downs that are going to happen during the course of their degree. And 27% said they'd be less likely to enroll in future semesters, perhaps jeopardizing their ability to actually complete their degree and instead of entering the some college no credential population. And so I'm going to hand it over to Carrie in a minute to get to the policy and kind of practitioner side of things. But I first want to bring in some other details to further contextualize these results that we've looked at today. So the one analysis of a recent beginning post-secondary student longitudinal study, which again is a nationally representative survey, one analysis found that over half of first-time enrolled students with children left college before finishing their degree or credential. And that's in comparison to under a third of their peers who didn't have children, right? Parenting students are much more likely to enter this some college no credential population, and that contributes to the fact that over a third of some college no credential learners are parents of children under 18. So this is a really important population of students to be targeting with our outreach efforts and with our support efforts while they're still in school. And I'll note here as well that there's a lot of research about parenting students who are a really important population, but there's less research that's expanding that caregiving net to include other dependents. But we know that parental education is strongly correlated with children's academic development and their likelihood of completing undergraduate degrees. So supporting these students is going to have intergenerational impacts. And overall, supporting caregivers is an important part of workforce development goals at the country level and at the state level. We need to be addressing these financial insecurity challenges, the challenges with time poverty, and with their sense of belonging. And so with that, let me pass it over to Carrie.
Thanks very much, May. You can go to the next slide. Thank you for teeing up the sort of intergenerational implications. The most recent data we have is that there are approximately 3.1 million students who are parenting, and we don't have that number on the caregiver level, but we know that they're parenting. And I did some back of the envelope math, and that equates to about 5.8 million children in those households, because the majority of parenting students have more than one children. Actually, 55% have more than one child. And so I wanted to look at what happens to the children in these households if their parents complete a college credential, and what does that mean for those children's college going. And I looked at some data that showed the likelihood of completing a bachelor's degree in 10 years for a first generation student. So that's if today's parenting students do not complete a credential, over 10 years, their likelihood of completing a degree is only about 20%, and that would be about 1.16 million of those 5.8 million children. But when we reverse that and think about what happens to the children in the households of those current parenting students who are able to complete a credential, and we see that that number rises by 22 percentage points to 42% over 10 years. And that means approximately 2.4 million of those children in those current parenting student households would be more likely to complete a bachelor's degree. Next slide, please. And thank you, May, very much for covering all this data so thoroughly. One of the things that we know is that more people with low incomes are enrolling in college and trying to complete credentials. We looked at some numbers that show that's about over 50% of undergraduate students now have incomes below 200% of the federal poverty level. And it's about 70% of parenting students who are estimated to have low incomes from some recent data from the Ed Trust. And then we know across all students, 58% have basic needs insecurity across food insecurity, housing insecurity, and homelessness. Next slide, please. So this is one of the reasons that we really like to think about what does it mean to support people in their access and enrollment of college credential, and thinking about all of the non-tuition barriers that they face from food, housing, childcare, transportation, healthcare access, and all of the things on the left are what we think about as traditional higher education supports, but really thinking about the variety of non-tuition supports available is incredibly critical. One of the recent data points that I looked at was that among first-generation students and continuing students, they said that they stopped out of college or did not complete their credential. Only about 16% of them, the reason was because they had academic challenges. Everything else was outside of the scope of what was actually happening in the classroom. So this is what we think about in a new vision to support access and completion. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? When we think about some of those supports outside of traditional higher education, this sort of left column are the categories, and then the second column are the programs that fall under those non-tuition support programs, and describing in the middle what they can do. So we've got the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. That is the primary federal program that supports people's ability to have a modest assurance they can afford food. There are certainly a variety of other resources and strategies that are available, including, food pantries, campus food pantries. There are community resources. We have chosen, for the purposes of this conversation, just focus on some of the federal and state funding streams. And the challenge with some of these programs is that, they're complex. We know that they are challenging to apply for. Everybody who applies for a program has to be a U.S. citizen, has to meet work requirements with very few exceptions. Many of these programs are time limited. Some of them have academic requirements that limit the type of program or the type of credential that somebody can pursue, and academic requirements as well that are similar to satisfactory academic progress. So then we think about cash assistance through the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It provides cash assistance to families with very low incomes. There are explicit restrictions on post-secondary education in many of these programs, so including SNAP and the TANF program. And then childcare assistance, what we think of most prominently in terms of federal and state funding streams are the Child Care Development Block Grant or Child Care and Development Fund, which is the nation's largest federal child care subsidy program. And then we also have Head Start and Early Head Start, which there have been some promising partnerships from institutions and our colleagues at the Association for Community College Trustees and the National Head Start Association, who are working together to bring Head Start locations onto college campuses, because many institutions do not have the resources to run childcare centers. So it's a really thoughtful partnership. In terms of childcare subsidies, there are also restrictions on education. And in SNAP, TANF, and childcare, there are significant flexibilities that states have to improve access to post-secondary education. So, for example, in the Child Care and Development Block Grant Program, states can prioritize post-secondary education, and some states do. So, for example, Georgia includes college students as a priority population, and Kentucky allows full-time students to receive a full childcare subsidy without additional work requirements. So states do have significant opportunity to expand on the policies that can improve access and completion. And then when we think about healthcare, unfortunately, until recently, work requirements were not mandatory in the Medicaid program, which is the primary way people with low incomes get access to healthcare services. Georgia had recently instituted work requirements in the program, but now due to HR 1, there are going to be new requirements in the Medicaid program. And previously, when states were discussing work requirements after the Affordable Care Act implementation, education was exempted to varying degrees. So some states decided full-time students did not also have to meet a work requirement, or, if you were a part-time student, you would also have to pair that with work, which was incredibly common. So one of the things that we will be looking for and hoping to see is that education will be account as an exemption from the work requirements in Medicaid. And we're not quite sure yet how those conversations are still ongoing right now at the federal and state level about what is going to be included to have access to Medicaid. And then housing assistance. So we think of the income-based housing choice voucher program, Section 8 and public housing. Housing assistance is one, not well federally funded. There's not enough resources to meet the need. But in addition to that, there are similar criteria to be able to access housing subsidies as there are for independent students in higher education. So mostly people who are enrolled and who are single do not have access to housing supports. And if you are an independent student, so that means you're married or you have a child, you're a veteran, things like that, you can get access to some housing supports, but there are also restrictions in those programs on the education programs you can participate in to get access. And then when we think about programs that can support, what we call in the workforce development, the public benefit space, employment and training programs, the employment and training arm of SNAP is SNAP ENT, and it can also provide supportive services for people who are SNAP eligible for childcare, transportation, tuition assistance, books, materials and uniforms, lab fees, things like that. And supportive services can also be funded through Perkins programs that are people who are enrolled in CTE programs for the same supportive services, as well as for Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act or WIOA programs, adult education, dislocated worker services, things like that for people enrolled in post-secondary programs. The thing I really want you to take away from this slide is, yes, these programs are complex. Yes, some of them have some significant barriers in them, but thinking about the broader resources that are available, particularly as states are going to be facing increased restrictions on resources, are going to be more critical to think about all of the ways that we can align federal and state funding streams to really support post-secondary access and completion. Next slide, please. Thank you, May. You can also find these recommendations in the report at the end of the report. So we'll just talk through some of them here. And I've already hit on a couple of them in some of the examples. But one of the things that we recommend for institutions is to collect and disaggregate student enrollment and success data by caregiving status. We know that we cannot serve our students unless we know who we are serving. So data collection is critical. And then there are two institutional policies that we recommend as best practices, particularly for parenting students. One is the institutional policy around including dependent care expenses as a cost in the cost of attendance. Right now, that policy usually means that a student has to have awareness that that policy exists, that they can include dependent care expenses in their cost of attendance. They oftentimes have to find a form and submit it, and submit the estimate of their cost or actual receipts of their cost, and then go through the process to have those expenses included. So ensuring that institutions are communicating with parenting or caregiving students about that opportunity, reducing the administrative burden in doing so, supporting their ability to submit and complete paperwork is incredibly important. And similarly, there's a policy that we call award displacement, which is when somebody gets a grant or scholarship and that grant or scholarship displaces the loans that they are able to take out. This policy was originally intended to prevent overborrowing by students. But what we really think is a best practice is giving students the opportunity to decide if that additional grant or scholarship should supplant or replace the loans that they would like to borrow, as opposed to institutions making that decision for them, because those additional resources could make or break their ability to enroll and persist. And then student-focused scheduling is also a best practice, really thinking about priority registration for parenting students, which we know some institutions have already engaged in, and then thinking about direct financial support and emergency aid and the ability to support people when they have a short-term financial hardship come up. Childcare resources, because we know, as May mentioned, are one of the largest barriers that parenting students face. There are a variety of what we call resource and referral agencies in states and in local areas that institutions can share information about, that point people to available childcare centers, as well as licensed childcare centers, understanding about what is a quality childcare center and where can you find them. And then connecting eligible students to some of those support programs that we talked about that institutions may have access to through existing partnerships on their campuses, such as through WEO or Perkins programs. Many states run what we call one-stop shops, and oftentimes they partner with colleges in terms of co-location or support on those services, as well as Perkins programs that can provide access for or support for childcare. And leveraging the childcare access means Parents in School or C-Campus program. We also recommend as a best practice. We understand that there are some administrative challenges in applying for and receiving those awards. And again, there aren't enough resources to go around. We also know that the C-Campus program is currently under threat. C-Campus was zeroed out in what we call the President's Skinny budget. It is currently included in the Senate version of appropriations, and it is zeroed out in the House bill. So all of that is to say we don't currently know what the future of C-Campus is, but this is hoping that it continues and putting that out in the universe. And then exploring on-campus childcare opportunities or partnerships with Head Start agencies, or even local childcare providers is another recommendation. And then we really think about community partnerships as well. So I'm a big believer in that, institutions are continuing to be asked to do more and more with existing or even less resources. And you don't always have to solve some of these problems on your own. You can partner with human services agencies, childcare agencies. An institution we worked with in Colorado had their local social services or human services office come onto campus. I think it was like once a week to do benefits application support and, be right there live to answer people's questions or help them with case management, recertification, submitting documentation so they could apply for or continue their benefits. And then really thinking about what are the community-based organizations that could either come on campus to provide services or that you can refer people to, and trying to find what those networks are in the area to be able to refer people to, or at least knowing where are the gaps where we really don't have support, and thinking about how to streamline the services that you provide as a result of what are some of the gaps in the community. One example, Delgado Community College that we worked with in New Orleans for a while was working with a faith-based organization to bring mental health services on campus. And so that was both, ongoing therapy services for students that need it, as well as just crisis intervention services. Next slide, please. And we touched on a couple of these in terms of federal and state policy recommendations. States have a variety of regulatory levers available to them to improve access to post-secondary education in TANF, SNAP, and childcare. So, for example, in Nebraska, they allow post-secondary education to basically count, as we call it, a countable work activity equal to work. So people can pursue education and, achieve long-term economic mobility. Some states have expanded SNAP eligibility for college students. There's a handful, California, Massachusetts, Washington, Oregon, to ensure that people in both 2 and in some instances 4-year programs can get access to SNAP. And then, as I mentioned, Georgia and Kentucky have really great, what I would consider exemplar policies in terms of prioritizing post-secondary students for their access to childcare subsidies. And, again, institutions and higher education advocates, and especially students, play a really important role in encouraging states and agencies to think about how to better coordinate and align their services and reduce some of those redundancies and maximize investments across all of the programs that we previously talked about a couple of slides ago. There are also some federal policy levers available, ensuring the SNAP and TANF programs do not restrict post-secondary education are two that are top of mind for me at present in the federal TANF legislation. Post-secondary education is limited to 12 months. Would love to see that completely eliminated. And similarly in SNAP, students are subjected to additional requirements that make it harder for them to get access to SNAP. So we recommend that Congress update that legislation to ensure that post-secondary education is treated equal to work. At present, there are 3 work requirements in the SNAP program. And in some instances, people are subjected to not just 1, but 2 of them. And to meet that work requirement, somebody can be working, they can be searching for work, they can even be participating in unpaid volunteering, but they cannot count enrollment in a post-secondary program towards their work requirement, which is an implicit disincentive for people to enroll and complete a college credential while maintaining access to their SNAP benefit. In the Child Care Development Fund, or CCDBG, Child Care Development Block Grant, which I've used interchangeably in this conversation, CCDBG is the authorizing legislation for the Child Care Development Fund. So apologies if that's confusing. We recommend, along with our child care advocate colleagues, increasing funding for the Child Care and Development Fund to ensure that more families with low income have access to child care supports. And the Child Care and Development Fund, as I've mentioned, states have some flexibility to improve access to post-secondary education, but we would really love to see that permanently codified at the federal level and for post-secondary education to be explicitly included and treated equal to work. And as I've mentioned, protecting and increasing funding for the C Campus program, as well as for the basic needs for post-secondary students and post-secondary student success grant programs, which have been under threat in various capacities over the last several months. And those are grants that go directly to institutions to be able to better support their students. So that is also a federal recommendation that we have. Next slide, please. Thanks, May. So we're going to go through a couple of resources. And as you can see, you can scan the QR code if you would like and access our most recent student financial wellness survey, as well as the report tied to this presentation on the right-hand side. Next slide, please. We are also currently recruiting for our 2025 student financial wellness survey. That survey is provided to institutions free of charge. So if you want to share this information, which as you can see, you can also find on our website or email surveys@trellisstrategies.org, please do feel free to share that widely with your networks, with institutions that you believe would be interested in participating, or reach out to us if you have any questions. Next slide, please. And then finally, if you have any follow-up questions for May and I, or any questions about any of our sources, or would just like to chat, ways to partner, ways to think about expanding on this work, we would love to hear from you. And I'm happy to turn it over to Allyson.
Thanks so much, Carrie and May. That was really great. We do have about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. So I've seen a few questions come in through the chat, through the Q&A function. So just a reminder that those are available to you if you have a burning question or thought for Carrie or May, but we can kind of go ahead and get started with what has come in. Let me just here. Someone did ask if the recording of this webinar would be available. So yes, we are recording this webinar and we will be providing the slides and the recording to all registrants. So you will be getting a copy of today's presentation along with the slides that Carrie and May prepared. Let me see, our next question is from Jeff Webster. Always nice to see my predecessor in the chat. Great question, Jeff. He asked if Trellis has any plans for future research on caregivers and or policy implications. So we are currently, just like Carrie mentioned, we're currently recruiting for our upcoming 2025 administration of the Student Financial Wellness Survey that kicks off in just a few weeks here. And in that survey, we will continue to capture caregiving and parenting status. We also added some expanded questions on the housing insecurity of parenting students. That's new to the instruments this year. And certainly in light of the potential cuts to C campus and other shifts in federal policy, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on things and how these pending or proposed changes can impact our caregiving and parenting students. So we can go ahead and get started with some other questions that came in through Q&A. And I'll just kind of pose these broadly to me and Carrie. Y'all can just jump in where it makes sense. So let's see, let's get started. What policy changes could help reduce the financial burden of caregiving on college students?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the question, Allyson. We did touch on a couple of them, and I'm happy to go over more of them if anybody has a specific question or wants to dig in a little bit more, but certainly ensuring that parenting or caregiving students have access to the full range of supports without restricting post-secondary education. We know that post-secondary education leads to, higher wages, lower unemployment, lower poverty, benefits for children that have, multiple ripple effects, as we touched on, and really ensuring that, particularly given changes in HR1 that are going to be imposing new restrictions on Medicaid, cutting the SNAP program, potential cuts to other programs, as we mentioned already from C campus. While I know that can feel disheartening and overwhelming, it really means is the time that we get more strategic about the resources we do have to try to reduce and mitigate that harm that we may potentially see from some of these cuts and the sort of downstream budget implications that it may have for state. So thinking about ways that public benefits, workforce development, employment and training, human services programs and communities can come together to try to make sure that people are not suffering, not just in the post-secondary context, but more broadly is going to be even more important.
Absolutely. Anything you want to add there, May?
I'll leave those policy considerations really to Carrie, but I'll note that I think from the institutional side, a lot of the importance is in getting that accurate information about who your parenting students are, so you can direct them to those appropriate resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we have another question in the Q&A from Stephanie. Great to see you, Stephanie. She's wondering what the impact of time limitations could be on parenting students who do get public housing support. HHS just released a proposed rule that would allow work requirements and time limits on housing supports. I'll kick that over to Carrie.
Yeah, so I hadn't seen that proposed rule yet, so thanks for sharing that. But, as we know from other programs that are time limited, what we ultimately see is harm to families and to children. I think some of the best research is from the TANF program, where we show that TANF has a federal 5-year time limit. Some states have made that even shorter, and that's cumulative. So even if somebody has spells where they come off the program and need to come back on it. What we actually see is that people who leave the TANF program are oftentimes no better off than they were when they were on the program. And my hypothesis is that because it restricts access to education, it's very difficult for people to actually experience an increase in wages if all they're doing is being relegated to low wage work. So research would suggest that time limits are going to overall be harmful to people's ability to access housing supports and to stabilize their families.
Yeah, and I just quickly connect that also to the information we have that that caregiving students are able to tend to progress more slowly through their degrees as well. So I haven't looked at this particular new rule either. I don't know exactly what those time limits are, but it could have an outsized effect on caregiving students compared to others who might be experiencing financial challenges in college.
Perfect. Thank you both. We can go ahead and move on to our next question. What message would you share with student caregivers who may be struggling to balance their responsibilities to their families and jobs with their education?
Oh, that's a tough one. You know, as a former parenting student, it took me 12 years to get my bachelor's degree. And one of the things, I like to tell every parenting student I meet that because it is my intention that is hopeful. And I like to share with them that it's a journey, not a destination. Oftentimes, as the Student Financial Wellness Survey shows, parenting students and caregiving students don't identify primarily as a student. This is something that they are doing while they are balancing other responsibilities. And it certainly is possible and it's worth it. I would, encourage them to keep going to the degree possible. But, one of the biggest challenges is really finding ways to do that without taking on extreme amounts of debt, because the longer your degree takes, the more likely you are to have greater debt, and doing it while working. So, trying to reassure parenting students that your path isn't going to look like other people's, and that's okay.
Anything you want to add there, May?
I think Carrie covered that absolutely beautifully, and I could not do as much justice. I'm seeing Beth's comment in the chat, and I'm pulling up the data to double check whether we calculated that. I don't believe we pulled GPA data for student parents, but I can echo that in a number of other studies have found that student parents tend to have higher GPAs. They tend to be really well motivated. They tend to be really excited to do well. They tend to perform slightly better on some mental health metrics because they have a really strong motivation to improve their lives and the lives of their families. And that plays into the fact that in a lot of other research as well, research that Trellis has done, research that other institutions have done, is that when caregiving students are provided support systems, those support systems are really effective. These students are really ready to take advantage of that support.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add to that is co-signing on everything May said is, the motivation is so real. Many parenting students, I know this was true for me, my desire to get a college credential or a degree was so much more about a lifeline out of poverty. And, being able to have that financial agency to, support myself and my son without having to have access to public programs and really wanting that freedom. And for traditional students, it's so much more about, this potentially rewarding career. I don't know, maybe their parents are making them go. But really knowing how high the stakes are, and that in some instances, it can be extreme to be able to break that poverty cycle and to, stabilize a family. And a college credential is more than just a pathway to a career for many parenting students and caregivers, particularly those with low incomes.
Absolutely. I think, we see across the board that student parents, just like what May and Carrie have been mentioning, student parents often perform better academically than their non-parenting peers. They have that high degree of motivation to succeed. So we do typically see that student parents have higher GPAs compared to those who are not parenting. I don't think we have that for this specific report, but that is a really good question. I think I'm not seeing any more questions come in. I'm going to wait maybe a few seconds here and then we can start kind of trying to wrap up with some final thoughts. But want to see if any other questions through the Q&A feature or through the chat before we wrap up for today. All right, looks like that is it. So I do want to give Carrie and May the opportunity to share any closing comments that they might have, any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up for today's webinar. We can start with Carrie.
Nothing from me, just a huge thank you to everyone who joined us.
Wonderful. May?
Yeah, I like that. A huge thank you to everyone. And an encouraging part of doing this kind of research is also getting to see all of the great work that people are doing to support caregiving students. I know there are a lot of fantastic events this month highlighting that work, and it's invigorating to be a part of this conversation. So I hope that the data and ideas that we've shared today are useful to you all as you move forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much, May and Carrie. If anyone has any further questions for us, we did share email contact information. You can also reach us at info@trellostrategies.org. Like I said earlier, we will be sharing the recording and slides from this presentation. And just wanted to thank again everyone for joining us as we kind of kick off Student Parent Month here at Trello Strategies with this webinar. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. And thanks again for joining us.